1.3 billion people worldwide are multidimensionally poor, and half of them are children under the age of 18. This is according to a United Nations Multidimensional Poverty Index. Now, it measures progress against the Sustainable Development Goal, which aims to end poverty in all dimensions. The index compares multidimensional poverty in over 100 countries and monitors changes over time. Well, to discuss this report, our correspondent William Denslow joins us now from New York. William, thank you so much for your time. Let's just talk about some of the key figures that have been identified in this report.
Yeah, Tomolo, as you so rightly mentioned, an absolutely hugely wide-ranging study. What is this? 1.3 billion people out of 101 nations that have been surveyed. And I think some of the key statistics coming out that around 2/3 of the people that are deemed to be multidimensionally poor live in South Asia or sub-Saharan Africa. Now, what we mean by multidimensionally poor, essentially this report is trying to get beyond just the perhaps more basic poverty figures that we've seen in the past, trying to really dig into other types of poverty, not just regarding income, but things like ability to access electricity, access to water, things like that as well as things like education as well. So this report, very damning as well when it comes to the impact on children, as you alluded to, mentions that children are far more at risk of multi-dimensional poverty than adults.
Now, how does then, William, this report differ from existing data?
Yeah, essentially, the message from some of the report's authors are that it's simply not doing enough to look at simple metrics that we've seen in the past, like just looking at a nation's index when it comes to their income inequality and poverty based on sheer amounts of monetary value. Essentially, this report tries to dig a little bit further, and it gives a few very interesting examples. For example, if we look at the case of Uganda, for one example, it states that while it has some metrics when it comes to multidimensional poverty that are somewhat in keeping with the rest of sub-Saharan Africa, if you look closer at that, very huge discrepancies. Looking at Kampala, for example, that shows very low levels of multidimensional poverty, far closer than the 1% or so that we see in Europe. But if we look at more remote areas, having that to levels that we see closer to much of South Sudan as well. So that's a huge point that this report is eager to stress. Another key aspect is looking at individual households, where it says that in cases such as India, for example, around a quarter of children under the age of 5, a quarter of these children will see in a household one of those children could be multidimensionally in poverty, but another one of those children under the same roof to not be the case. So that just shows how much of a discrepancy poverty really has across the world.
Now, we've just spoken about Uganda. Let's take a more closer look at South Africa at this point, William. How did South Africa fare?
Well, South Africa, according to this report, really did fare pretty well. Now, looking at sub-Saharan Africa, which has a multidimensional poverty rate of around 56% or so, South Africa doing far better than that. Just looking at the statistics now, if we look at Europe first, that's at 1.1% according to this report. South Africa, though, is at 6.3%. That's the best in sub-Saharan Africa compared to rates of, for example, nearly 92% in South Sudan. Looking at some other metrics as well, looking at severe multidimensional poverty, South Africa at 0.9% versus 74% in South Sudan. That compared to a 57% average in sub-Saharan Africa as well. Now, looking at those that are potentially vulnerable, that's up at 12% in South Africa. And also looking a little bit further into these multi-dimensions that are, of course, so important in this report. Looking at South Africa, stated that the country ranks better when it comes to education, but somewhat lags behind education when it comes to health and standard of living. One potential area of concern is looking at the proportion of the percentage of the population living below what's seen as a widely considered global index of poverty, seen as the income rate of $1.90 per day. According to this report, some 19% of South Africans living below that rate.
Yeah, I'm sure, Willem, you'd agree with me that the authors of this report had an intention with it. What impact do you think this report, especially when it comes to, from the author's perspective, what do you think they were hoping to achieve with this?
Well, essentially the message is that previous metrics when it comes to poverty don't do enough to answer the key question of how and what can global governments do to address this problem once and for all. And as this report alludes to, it's not just enough to look at one particular country that suffers when it comes to poverty regarding income, things like that. You need to look at other factors that really contribute to it, and also look at individual households that could see poverty among some children, some family members, but potentially not others. And the idea and the hope of this report is to try and help governments to tailor policies that better amend those needs and to better be able to help individual communities rather than paint the issue of poverty with a wide brush. And of course, this all comes under the wider aspect of the United Nations, which of course is to try and eliminate extreme poverty by 2030, which is of course the first goal as part of the Sustainable Development Goals.
Absolutely, William. Of course, that's part of the global goals there. William Denstow, thank you so much for your time.